Thank you. So you can see the title. I'm going to be talking about a certain strand within phenomenology, and I will mention along the way some applications and why it's important. And I'll start with a very, very brief study of the history of 20th century philosophy. So these are the most important figures, or anyway, they can stand in for the most important figures, since it gives you a good idea of the rift between continental philosophy with a capital C and Anglo-Saxophone philosophy. I guess Wittgenstein is not quite Anglo-Saxophone, but on the other hand, and the idea is that everything started with Aristotle and everything will continue forever with Aristotle, and more specifically with Aristotelian realism. And in the 20th century, of course, there have been all kinds of departures from the Aristotelian realist approach. In fact, in every century, there were many departures from the Aristotelian realist approach, but we're going to be concentrating on Aristotelian realism. And this I will assume, consists in three major premises, all of which I think are obviously true by now in the year 2025. So it's obviously true that the world exists. It's obviously true that we have common sense knowledge of the world, and indeed that all of our ancestors have had common sense knowledge of the world. And the proof of that is that we are alive today. And then finally, in more recent times, we have scientific knowledge of the world. And that is a very complicated problem, which particular theories and sub-theories of physics we should take seriously, what we should say about theories of the social structures in the world. So there are many gaps in our scientific knowledge. There will always be many gaps in our scientific knowledge. Not even with the development of AI, there will always be gaps in our scientific knowledge. But these are the three axioms which I'm going to start with. And then the real question is, what is the background to this philosophical realist, this Aristotelian approach in 20th century philosophy? And here we get a slightly thinner survey of the important figures. The early Husserl stands out for all kinds of reasons. Russell was very important as a realist philosopher. The Wittgenstein of the Tractatus is intriguingly important. He's not the world's clearest realist philosopher, but certainly he was at that time a realist. And then of all the great figures of 20th century analytic philosophy, we don't have any of those great figures left today, except perhaps for Searle, who is the singular great realist in 20th century analytic philosophy. And now Husserl, born in Prostejov and died in, I'll guess this, Przedni Rakuzy, which was sort of part of Austria. So he lived all his life in Austria in the extended Austro-Hungarian sense. Leaving aside those parts of his life when he was in Germany proselytizing philosophical ideas, which we're all familiar with. I'm particularly interested, along with Jobst, in the early Husserl, when Husserl was a staunch realist. He was not much influenced by the crazy transcendental idealist philosophies of the German, let's say the North German world. And he was responsible for coining the term formal ontology. And that is one of his most important contributions to philosophy. He created a space for formal ontological thinking. And now it turns out that this formal ontological thinking is very important today. And you can find some background as to why it's important on this video. It's important because it is a new way in which philosophy students can get jobs, interesting jobs. And this is about careers in ontology. It was created by the American Philosophical Association, and then this is something else also created by the American Philosophical Association, who have a special interest in finding ways in which young philosophers can have successful and interesting careers. So we are commercializing ontology, it says here. We are, in fact, making ontology useful or showing how ontology can be useful in all kinds of areas. We're working with government people in the US, potentially also in other parts of the world. That's a long story, which I can address in the questions if you wish. We're working with large and small scale commercial organizations. We've been working for 20 years now with biomedical researchers and with hospitals and so forth. And now it's becoming very important to explore how ontology can help AI in its stumbling way to avoid creating hallucinations, and in other ways in which we can help AI, including warning people of the way in which AI is often associated with rather dangerous forms of hype. And now, if you want to see evidence for this, you can go to one or other of the job sites which we have in the United States. So if you go to indeed.com and enter the word ontology, you will get something like 20 job offers on any given day, along with something like 200 job offers which mention ontology as one possible associated skill, sometimes under the heading of semantic technology. Now, it has to be said that most of these ontology jobs involve some experience in computer science, but some of them, for instance, in my own case, and in the case of my students, all of whom, practically speaking, have very nice jobs, it did not involve any kind of study of computer science. It involved learning certain logical and other features which are involved in applying ontology, but it's still basically a philosophical enterprise which we're supporting. And when I say we, I mean not these people, but the Department of Philosophy in the University of Buffalo, where we are starting a new program in applied ontology, and a Master's of Science degree and a PhD degree. Now, so this is what I call the Munich School, or the Munich Göttingen Krakow School. It started in Munich. Some of its members invaded Göttingen to work with Husserl in Göttingen, and then some of those members moved over to Poland and created a small offshoot of the Munich School in Poland, all of which will be important for what follows. And what they did was they took the formal ontological ideas, the realist formal ontological ideas in Husserl's logical investigations, which they regarded as a kind of Bible of good philosophy, and applied it outside the formal domains of, for instance, mathematics and logic. They applied it to various material domains. So these are some examples. There were something like 15 members of the Munich School. I'm going to be talking just about these 6, together with, and of course, Wojtyła we'll come to in a minute. So he was a member of the Krakow wing of the Munich School. And you can see the range of topics. They're all topics which are more or less related to philosophy as we understand it. But then some of the Munich people dealt with areas like chemistry and physics. So it goes beyond what you can see on the screen here. So we're talking now about this picture of the important developments in 20th century realist philosophy. There are, of course, one or two other figures. I can't think of any offhand, but there are one or two other figures of importance. But this will be enough to keep us occupied this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're sitting at the moment. All right, so they started in Munich. One of the leaders of the Munich School is the great and much renowned Johannes Daubert, who never published a word of philosophy in his life, but who was the one person who was allowed to ask Husserl difficult and critical questions. And so we have a large body of manuscripts relating to Daubert's own thinking and to his interactions with Husserl, which were being transcribed by Karl Schumann. Some of them, I hope, are still being transcribed, and you can find also some writings on Daubert's thought in my own bibliography and in the work of Karl Schumann and of some other people who are exploring the wonders of Daubert. Daubert was particularly interested in Sachverhalte, which is the German word for states of affairs. And he was also interested in Wertverhalte, which are states of values, which is not an absolutely clear expression. And then also in Frageverhalte, which are states which are somehow put into question. And in all of these areas, he wrote really very interesting work. And then Max Scheler, who was much more famous and wrote many, many things, a great philosopher, but also somewhat crazy in all kinds of directions, very influential in his day in all kinds of directions. And apart from Husserl, he was the most important figure in this Munich, Göttingen, and then we'll come to Krakow in a minute. Ingarden is at the bottom here. He is the Pole. Edith Stein is on the right. Adolf Reinach will become very important in a minute. He was regarded by the members of the Munich and then the Göttingen school as the phenomenologist's phenomenologist. And he was the person who is described as having really created the greatness that is Husserl, because he was a much better teacher than Husserl. And so he was able to communicate Husserl's ideas to a wider circle of people, of which you see only a small dabbling on this screen. And then we move over to Krakow. This is Wojtyła, who was a friend of Ingarden's and who became the Pope. And this is very interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon because we have a relatively small philosophical movement, two members of which were canonized. And this is a rather amazing phenomenon. I think I've said that already, and I will say it many times. So this means that it may very well be the case that the Munich Realist School is a particularly interesting area of philosophical contributions in the context of the philosophy of religion, but also in the context of ethics. So canonized people, we assume, are very ethical people. But that I'm not responsible for ethics. I just do ontology. And so I'm going to leave that aside. All right, so this is Reinach with Edith, or Edith, I should say. And this is Edith herself. And she was a saint of the Catholic Church, but also one of 6 patron saints of Europe, which I think is also quite nice from some directions. And now Reinach. Why was Reinach important? Well, in 1913, Reinach wrote a habilitation on the a priori foundations of the civil law. And this is all about what Reinach called social acts, which are acts in which we use language in order to achieve something. For instance, when we make an agreement with somebody or when we make a promise to somebody, then that is a social act. And now speech act theory, which was developed some 47 years later in England by Austin and Searle, is really a kind of echo of what Reinach had to say about the ontology of social acts in the context of the law, but also more generally in the context of an understanding of the way language works. And so one of the reasons to be interested in the Munich Realist Phenomenology movement is that it can help you extend the power of Searle and Austin when they are thinking about speech acts in a less crisply and determinately ontological way. All right, so back to good old Eddie. So the logical investigations are in part about formal ontology. They also are an important contribution to our understanding of logic, to our understanding of language, to our understanding of evidence, and therefore also of truth. And I'm going to talk here only about one thread through the logical investigations, which is manifested most clearly in the third logical investigation on the theory of wholes and parts. And in the third logical investigation, we find this very important paragraph where Husserl says that he's going to be addressing the fundamental questions of the pure theory of wholes and parts, which belongs to formal ontology. That is the first appearance of this phrase, formal ontology, in world literature. And he defines formal ontology as the theory of those ontological structures which apply in all domains, which means in physics, in geography, in biology, in common sense. All domains use simple part-whole relations. They use the difference between what is general and what is particular. And they do many of the other things which form part of formal ontology always. And Husserl would say, and I would say, and I'm not claiming that everyone would say this, but Husserl and I would say that when they apply these formal ontological structures in all of these domains, then they do it in the same way. And the issue is to catalog what that same way is. And that's where the difficulty comes in. So these are the bits and pieces which Husserl mentions. He mentions others, but these are the important ones. The theory of part and whole is clear. That's mereology, which was then developed formally in great detail by the Polish school of Leśniewski and his followers. And then the theory of dependence, which means the relation between one thing such as a color and another thing such as an extension, where the color is dependent upon the extension because the color can't exist unless the extension exists. And we have other axes or dimensions of formal ontology, of boundaries and species and so forth, which we will return to in due course. So one of the accounts which Husserl gives is that formal ontology deals with the interconnections of things, where formal logic deals with the interconnections of truths. So if we're dealing with formal ontology, we deal with the relations between objects and properties. If we're doing formal logic, then we deal with the relations between propositions or sentences or assertions or statements or truths more generally, which constitute consistency or inconsistency and so forth. And so we have formal logic and formal ontology. There was also formal axiology, which Husserl dealt with in later writings, not in any great detail in the logical investigations, but formal axiology is an application of the same approach, namely a universal top-level structure for all of values, ethics, and so forth. All right, so what does an ontological structure look like? This is a structure which we can call a pair. And let's just assume that and when I say pair, I don't mean banana or peach, I mean P-A-I-R. So the A is a banana and B is a peach, and they stand next to each other. And so we have what we might call the ontological structure, which is a pair of objects. And we might say that this pair of objects has the property of two-ness because it has two members. So it's an object aggregate with two members. The only parts of this object aggregate are A and B. Now let's suppose that A and B stand in some relation to each other. It might be the relation of adjacency, might be a more interesting relation. Then B is dependent upon that relation. Then that relation is dependent for its existence on both A and B. That relation, for instance, that particular state of adjacency between the banana and the peach could not exist unless the banana and the peach exist. If we replace the banana with a different but exactly similarly shaped banana, we would have a different relation. It would be exactly the same kind of relation, but it would be a different instance. And now we might have a more interesting relation. So let's take, for instance, the relation between John and Mary when John makes a promise to Mary. And we will have, we'll deal with this structure later on, because this is the core of Reinach's theory of the promise. And you'll see that we now have two-sided mutual dependence, but I'll come back to that later. And here we have the part-whole relation. And here we have an interesting application. So this is a Sachverhalt. It's a kind of state of affairs, which is very common in some parts of the world where there are people where one man falls in love with a woman. And then we have the universal relation between a man and a woman, which we call love. But now we're interested not in the universal relation. We're interested in that specific relation, which started yesterday when Jack fell in love with Jill, and which we'll call love 464. Then that universal relation has an instance in this specific relation. And so we're already moving in very deep waters in ontology. So for instance, if Jack loves Jill and the love is 464 love, then Jill loves Jack, then is the love between Jill and Jack the same instance as the love between Jack and Jill? That's just a question. I'm not going to give you the answer. It would take too long. All right, so then we have laws governing essences, we'll talk about essences in a minute. Laws governing universals, which we sometimes call essential laws. We have essential structures or essential configurations. And one example of an essential structure, which is the term Wesenszusammenhang is used by Reinach, is the structure of the promise, which I showed you 2 minutes ago. And then we have various formal ontological categories, some of which I've mentioned already. Each of these are able to figure in complex structures in non-arbitrary law-governed ways. And that's where we get the essential laws. So an example of an essential law would be that every relation of love is dependent upon some organism, let's say, probably dependent on some human being or some higher mammal. And we have relations such as exclusion, that red excludes green. In other words, the same extension cannot have both the color red and the color green, and so on. There are many such laws that you can find in Husserl and in some of the commentary on Husserl. Now, formal ontology is a bit like mathematics. So if we build out formal ontology formally with axioms and proofs, then we can prove things which will apply to all formally similar structures in the whole wide world, both the past, the present, and the future, in the whole wide universe, indeed. Just as we can prove a theorem in mathematics, and then we can be sure that wherever the constituent parts of the theorem are realized in the universe, then the theorem will still be true. So this means that formal ontology is very general. It's general in the way that mathematics is general. And that's why the Munich realist phenomenologies are so important, because they are applications of formal ontology across a very general geographical area. I mean geographical in the philosophical sense, so relating to ethics and physics and other domains. So formal ontology is indeed defined as the theory of those ontological structures which apply to all domains whatsoever. So a formal ontology is, in this sense, a top-level ontology. And there are formal domains and there are material domains. Formal means now domain neutral, and material means specific to a specific domain, such as stamp collecting or zoology or geography or traffic patterns in Prague and so on. So we can build material ontologies in very many domains, and some of them might be very specific, as we shall see. And then and people are building these ontologies all the time. They have been doing for the last 50, 70 years. But many of those ontologies which people have been building, these material ontologies, did not have a foundation in formal ontology. And that's why they have disappeared, because they were ontologies which worked in one particular lab or one particular research project, but they didn't work anywhere else. And so when the money ran out for the research project, the ontologies disappeared. The formal and material ontologies that I'm working with have existed now upwards of 20 years, and they are used by thousands of people, I think I'm able to say at this point, maybe even more than that. All right, so one important contribution to the success of an ontology is that the terms in the ontology are defined. And here we recommend the so-called Aristotelian definition approach, where a definition tells you what genus a certain kind of entity, a certain species belongs to. In other words, the parent kind or the parent universal, and what the specific difference is, which makes the instances of the species instances of that species, as contrasted with all the other instances of the genus which do not instantiate that species. And that having been said in a somewhat complicated way, we have a simple example. Human is the species, animal is the genus, rational is the specific difference. And so that is our goal, that is our template for a good definition. And it's harder than it looks in some cases. And what is very hard is to get different ontologies to agree on definitions in areas where they have a different approach or different interests. And that is part of the job of the ontologist that we train, in Buffalo, and that maybe will be trained in other places to work out how you can resolve disputes in definitions amongst people who are trying to follow the rules of formal ontology. So if we're going to build definitions by defining the parent term of a species, a kind, a universal, a type, I'll use all of those words synonymously for present purposes. So if we always need to have the next highest level, eventually we will reach the top. And then we don't have any way of formulating a definition. So the terms at the very top are what we call primitive. You just have to accept them. And in the ontology world, we give examples and we give elucidations, we tell stories, but we don't try to give definitions of terms at the very top. And when I say definition now, I mean a statement of necessary and sufficient conditions. So this was recognized already by one of Husserl's predecessors. So he pointed out that, and this was a long time ago, of course, the intellect grasps the meanings of terms when it comprehends in a definition what a thing is. But definitions are constructed, he's following Aristotle, you see, by using more universal terms. And these are defined by more universal terms until we come to the highest and most universal. Consequently, unless these latter are known, the less universal cannot be grasped in a definition. So you can't start doing ontology unless you have a top level ontology. Now, Aristotle, who was pretty good as a philosopher, created the world's first top-level ontology. He also created the world's database, the world's first database, but about constitutions of cities. But that's another story. This is quite important, but it's not perfect. So some of it we use today, but it's too small in some ways it misses things, but it's also too large in other ways because it includes things which are not fully top level. Now, what we have today instead is an international standard ontology. We also have an international standard for being a top level ontology, which is the international standard number 218381, part 1, which was validated, authorized, approved by the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission as the top level ontology standard. And so the International Standards Organization are responsible for things like the ways in which you can measure wood when you export it from one country to another. So they are very much in the interests of communication between different cultures in important and economically crucial ways, in having standardization which everyone can share. Now they have it for ontology. And the International Electrotechnical Commission is responsible for the fact that the plugs in your building will work when you plug into the sockets in your building. So they are good for things like electricity supply standardization, which is not completely removed from what the top level ontology is all about, since we have ontologies of these things. All right, so Husserl's formal ontology, we've seen enough. It's presented here, and you can read the English translation, which is not bad. We have our heroes from Munich. We have the areas where they worked. There are many more, but this list is a good place to start. So we are now extending Husserl's formal ontology to represent and define the universals in different material domains. Now we have Adolf again, and we have Edith, and we have the structure of the promise, which I mentioned before. So, and this is all Reinach's ontology, the material ontology of social acts. This is a particular part of the material ontology of social acts, which refers to promising. To have a promise, you have to have a promisor and a promisee. Both promisor and promisee are typically human beings, but you can have collective promises, you can have collective promisees, and Reinach goes through all the different kinds of promisor and promisee that we can have. In a court of law, for instance, when you declare an oath and so forth. And then the promise itself consists of three mutually dependent parts, which are an act of speaking, a certain content, and then most importantly, an act of registering. So you can't make a promise all by yourself in a dark room. The promisee has to be present in some way. You can make a promise via Zoom. I promise that I will now move to the next slide. There was an act of speaking. I'm not sure that there was an act of registering, because I have no idea whether you're still out there, but I'm assuming that you registered my promise, which I will now fulfill. And what I did when I made this promise 20 seconds ago was to give rise to a mutually correlated pair of states of claim on the one hand and obligation on the other hand. I have the obligation and you all have the claim. And because this is a real promise, the promise gave rise to a tendency towards realization, which I just realized by pressing the relevant button. And so this is getting pretty close to a structural picture of the ontology, the material ontology of the promise. And many of the parts of this are used. For instance, the command is this picture, but the promisee is switched with the promisor. Now the promisees, the people who are, now the promisor is replaced by the commander, and the people who are being commanded, the troops, are the commandees. But you have the act of speaking, the act of registering. So nearly everything applies, but now the obligation and the claim are switched around. It's the commandees which have the obligation and the commander who has the claim. All right, so we've seen that. Now, we have basic formal ontology, which extends Husserl. This whole thing extends Aristotle, of course, but it cleans up Aristotle in some ways. And we have three new areas where we need to do some formal ontology. And if we put these three new areas together with Husserl's dimensions of his formal ontology, then we get what we call basic formal ontology. And this is a snapshot of how basic formal ontology looks. It's about a third of the whole ontology, and you get the idea. We have material entities such as people, we have qualities such as temperature, we have dispositions such as the tendency to realize a promise, and we have roles such as being the promisee of a promise, and so forth. And we have processes, and we have things which continue to exist and things which occur. And now this ontology here was created as part of a very big effort in 2002, 3, 4, to create a suite of ontologies to cover all of biomedicine as it then existed. This is called the Obo Foundry, and it's based on BFO. And if you look at the very top, you see continuant, occurrent, independent, dependent. That is what you see at the very top of BFO. And then we also have a current, which is also at the very top of BFO. So BFO was in fact created by reverse engineering the important parts of the biomedical ontologies that we were building at that time. And since then, we've added an environment ontology. We've added an ontology for the investigations that people perform in biomedicine. And then we added an information artifact ontology, which includes all the papers, databases, grant funding documents, footnotes, all of those exciting things which you need to study ontologically if you're going to understand the way, for instance, scientific research or government administration works. All right, so BFO is an ISO standard. Free even, it costs you 0 Swiss francs to get a copy, so you should rush and buy one. You can find it on the web somewhere here. There should be a link. But anyway, this is ISO IEC 21838-2. The new version will be appearing in a year or so. It is basic formal ontology, which is a top-level ontology, which is a part of information technology. And so it went through committees of the ISO IEC at all of these levels before it could be approved. This is another page. It says it costs 92 francs on this page, but then if you click on this blue bit here, it says this standard can be downloaded from the blah blah website, and it's free if you download it. All right, so this is a memorandum for Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer Council members and Intelligence Community Chief Data Officer Council members of the United States Department of Defense and the United States Intelligence Community. And if you look at the yellow bit, it says that all members of these groups are to follow the 3 baselines: top-level ontology, basic formal ontology, common core ontology, which is a collection of domain ontologies created to fit the BFO template. These will set the baseline standards for formal DoD and IC ontology. And we're moving further even than that in the meantime. This is about a year and a half old. So these are some examples. We have hundreds of examples now of domain ontologies which have been defined on the basis of BFO. Again, this is the tiny snapshot. This is an example of how it looks when you add a fragment of another ontology to BFO. So we have processes, we have cognitive processes. Cognitive process is not part of BFO because it's not top level. And then different kinds of cognitive processes are planning and thinking and learning and so forth. So the mental functioning ontology is much bigger than what you see here, but this will give you some idea of how it fits with BFO. And then we have the emotion ontology, which extends the mental functioning ontology to include things like an affective representation or an emotional action tendency. That would be the case where someone makes you really angry, and so you slug him with your fist. Then you are realizing an emotional action tendency. And realization is another topic which is dealt with in BFO under the heading of disposition. All right, so you're getting the idea. Now, the emotion ontology is very big, and if we go to appraisal, which is a kind of cognitive representation, we have these 9 different kinds of appraisal: appraisal of causal intent, appraisal of social attention, appraisal of loss, and so forth. And if we go to physiological response to emotion, then that includes breathing at a slower rate, or your muscles becoming tense, or your high temperature, or your blushing, and so forth. And then there are different kinds of feeling calm, feeling rational, feeling weak, feeling restless, feeling in control, and so on. These are all sub-universals of the universal subjective emotional feeling, which is a part of the emotion ontology. And then we're beginning to see laws of essence. And so what we can do is we can see the let's take an example, the feeling restless as being a universal. And then when you're feeling restless because you're all dying to ask me questions, then you are instantiating the universe, or rather a feeling inside you is instantiating the universal feeling restless. But now there is also the essence of feeling restless. What is it to feel restless? And when we start thinking about essence in this way, then we're looking at the essential laws governing restlessness. And we're looking at the essential structures which restlessness partakes in. So to be restless, you have to have a human being or a higher mammal and so forth. And I won't go any further into this restlessness business. I will take the opportunity of having a pause while you ask questions. And so I hope that I will hear you. So Jobst, can you just do a microphone check?
Yes, you should hear me now.
Good.
I can see that you hear me from the green border around the picture.
I know, but you're cleverer than I am.
Now, if you want to ask questions, please come closer to the microphone so that it gets recorded. So this is you can come here and sit here to ask the question.
Hello.
Hello.
I just want to ask, is there some easy way to describe the difference between BFO and the schema.org ontology?
Good. All right. So there are a number of different paradigms for the ways ontologies are developed. One paradigm is the one that you've seen here, which is a rather slow and careful paradigm, which has taken 20 years to perfect and which has then a long half-life. The ontologies produced under this paradigm tend to be ones which last a long time. Another paradigm is to go out and look at all the ontologies that have been created and then pick bits from each and create a kind of quick and dirty, I'm not trying to be rude now, quick and dirty ontology which will suit your needs. And I mentioned already that if you do the latter, then you will have an ontology which will suit your needs, but it will not suit your needs later when you need to link your data with someone else's data. Now, the third paradigm is illustrated by schema.org and by the other big knowledge graphs which have been produced. Wikidata is another one, which have been produced by different organizations with access to a lot of data and with the infrastructure to build really big ontologies like that. Now, my assumption is that gradually those ontologies will be let's say, enhanced or improved by the kind of ontologies at the top level, which I've been talking about here. And the reason for that is manifold, but when you are building ontologies, one of your goals is to have a reliable, trustworthy, easily accessible way of understanding whether two terms in your ontology mean the same thing or mean different things, how they are to be used in relation to other terms, and so forth. And these big ontologies, they're full of overlapping terms because they don't really have definitions. Some of them don't have any definitions at all. And so they're useful for certain purposes, for data mining and so forth. They may even be useful for purposes of well-structured, careful ontology building, but they're not careful, well-structured ontologies. And so they fail when it comes to those kinds of applications where you need trustworthiness, and I would dare to say truth. And I think that in AI, we're beginning to see what happens when you don't use ontologies which have been created in order to establish trustworthiness and truth and so forth.
I mean, these huge ontologies, they are essentially full of self-contradiction. You can derive from them a lot of self-contradicting statements, right, which are logically false. So you can derive a definition of a concept that is equivalent, and then the concept you can then, by using the hierarchy, derive another definition, and they are logically self-contradicting. And when you have this, then you cannot do any mechanical theorem proving. You cannot use the ontology for inference. You cannot essentially use it to annotate data because you end up, the contradictions will then poison your annotations. So I believe that it creates huge problems, and there are many such ontologies in many domains that have been built like this, that are basically, for example, they then have the problem that the relations they contain mean different things in different parts of the ontology, and so though I'm more pessimistic with regard to improving AI with ontologies than Barry is. I believe that for the deterministic part for which you can use ontologies and should use them, they should be structured in a way that if you use them in logical context, you are not ending up with self-contradictions. And so BFO itself is free of this, and some of the ontologies which were built using BFO are also free of this, but not all of them, because the engineers or people building them are not always following all the rules you should follow. Some of which are very hard to follow, like avoiding multiple parentship. It's very, very hard, right?
And that's why we need to train more ontologies in the proper methods of ontology.
So I have another question, Barry. If you could move back to the slide with emotional reaction, please.
There?
No, the one with the muscle. Yes. No, go back. Yes.
Yeah.
So here, so there I have already a problem. So that says muscles becoming tense and there's muscles relaxing. Why isn't there just change of muscle tone? And why isn't there just change of breathing rate? Why is, so to speak, are both opposites of this? You're done? Okay. Opposite of the spectrum they're listed. Is this good modeling practice? How would you see this? Also blushing, you should have change of blood circulation in the surface of the facial skin instead of blushing, because there are many degrees of blushing. You can turn white also, or green almost, right? And so why is this done like this?
So that would be a more ambitious way of approaching the matter, but we would still need to have terms as children of the terms that you favor. For instance, green blushing and so forth.
Yeah, I agree.
Do justice to specific kinds of data. So this too involves an element of simplification.
I just thought
it depends on whether you're addressing what we can think of as being the average user of an emotion ontology, and whether you're dealing with somebody who really wants to understand the physiology of emotion. And then we would.
So when my muscles were becoming tense when I saw this, actually. because it's so primitively done.
Yeah, well, then we hit the jackpot with that particular term.
Will you address later in the lecture also this problem of multiple inheritance?
I will not know, but
Okay.
I can address it now if you wish.
Yeah, so I would like to ask two questions on this. The first one is there are two big questions when you build such ontologies. The one is, do you have all the children of physiological response to emotions listed here? Of course not. So should you now introduce others as a category? Certainly not. Maybe you can answer this question first.
So if you have a physiological response to emotion case where there is no term in the ontology, then you have two solutions to the problem which arises when you're using the ontology. One is to inform the editor of the ontology that you would like to have a new term added. And we try to bring it about that there is always an email address which is always manned by some human being who will then consult with the other editors of the ontology and make the necessary change if it is a well-motivated request. The second response is you use the term physiological response to emotion, but you don't use any of the children. In that way, you haven't made a mistake. You can add a comment to the effect that it's actually a physiological response to emotion of this and this type, but you won't be able to use any ontology term other than physiological response to emotion.
Yes. Okay. And now the second question, and I ask this on behalf of all of you because it's so important, is multiple inheritance. So, for example, muscles becoming tense is also a reaction to pain. Pain is not necessarily an emotion, but it's before there's an emotion related to pain, anxiety, stress, and so on. But pain in itself is a sensation out of which emotions can follow. Some people even like it, masochists, so they can have other emotions from pain. But basically, becoming tense is also a reaction to pain. Now, can you say something about this? And you have this everywhere, in every domain. Also, not in the top domain, but everywhere in all the material ontologies have this problem of multiple possible parents. So can you say something about this, please, Barry?
So what we're dealing with here are processes, and processes that there is no easy way to address this multiple parenting problem. The way in which it is de facto addressed is that we have different ontologies for different areas. So we do have a pain ontology, and we're working on improving the pain ontology quite significantly at the moment. And we have the emotion ontology, and there is a certain overlap with those two where we have to invest extra analysis in order to try and eliminate the issues which arise because of multiple parentage in that area. So it takes work, and there's no simple recipe. But there is there is a recipe when we're dealing with terms like dog or banana or building, or even diseases like meningitis. So meningitis is my favorite example. Meningitis is an infectious disease. And so we could say that the parent of the term meningitis is infectious disease, but meningitis is also a disease of the meninges. And so we could say that the parent of meningitis should be disease of the meninges. But we have a solution to this problem, which was invented by Aristotle, actually. From Aristotle's writings, we can derive the recipe that a genus is a genus of a species only if an instance of the species ceases to be an instance of the genus, then it ceases to exist. So you are a human being. If you cease to be a human being, you will cease to exist. Now, so what does this say about meningitis? Well, if meningitis ceases to be a disease of the meninges, it will cease to exist. And so that means that this might be a good candidate parent. But if it ceases to be infectious because we've given some drug or vaccine or something, then it doesn't cease to exist. And so infectious disease is not a good parent for meningitis. So that recipe works very well in very many cases. And that's one of the things that we teach people. It's one of the ways in which Aristotle did really good work.
And now to finish, I have a third question, then you should ask questions again. So my third question is, so what you were saying is if we would have muscles changing tone, right? As a physiological response to emotion, one could argue that the qualification of this, if you qualify this in the ontology more and more, you are basically trying to model propositions ontologically. Already, so in a way, change of muscle tone is already a nominal phrase that is describing Sachverhalt. So how deep should we go? Because one could also argue one just has the ontology, one stops at a certain level of granularity and then uses proposition logic based on the elements of the ontology to create propositions. So what's your view on this?
So this has a very easy question. So it takes human effort and carefulness and so forth to build ontologies, which takes money. And the amount of money that you have to build a given ontology is finite, which means that there is a natural throttle to the degree to which you can build out an ontology to be ever more complicated. That natural throttle has worked very well, in fact. I disagree with you that there is a danger here that we start creating sentences as ontology labels. So change of muscle tone is not a sentence. It describes.
And I know this.
Yeah, I know you know it.
But one could argue that at some level, when you make the nominal phrase longer and longer and longer, it gets very close to a full proposition.
Yeah. So
only missing the copula, you know.
I don't know of any examples where this problem has arisen. So the longest expressions you can find in the gene ontology, because some of the genomic structures that they are identifying scientifically they're captured in long, very technical phrases. But nobody finds it a problem because they use those technical phrases all the time in their work. So that kind of expansion of an ontology will happen only when it's useful.
Okay, so more questions on this part.
Maybe I
Is there two? So you should.
Hello, it's me again.
Yep.
Is it the case that BFO is unique in the fact that it is based on the Aristotelian ontology, or is it the case that other ontologies are not?
No, so there are other ontologies which are not based on Aristotle. They tend to be not very successful ones. As you saw, BFO is based on Aristotle only to a certain degree. And there are other ontologies, which are one of which, the Dolce ontology, which comes from Italy, is very similar to BFO in this respect. It draws on the same kinds of contributions from Aristotle that BFO draws on. The difference is that there are hundreds of people using BFO, and at any given time, there are not very many people using Dolce.
Okay. Another question over there.
Yes, I'm not. No.
Just come here.
Hi.
Hello.
I have just a quick question. You were speaking about environmental ontology. I was just wondering if you could draw more on it.
Good. So this is a very hard one. The environment ontology that we have is called ENVO, ENVO. And if you go to Google and you enter ontology lookup service or just OLS ontology, then it will take you to one of two or three places where you can get all the ontologies which have been developed, particularly in the biomedical domain. So you get ENVO there. You could also Google ENVO and you can see what it contains. So ENVO is very ambitious. It includes the environments of bacteria for instance, on a hamburger, or it can include the environments of crows flying high in the sky, or of elephants trudging through the jungle, or of the tiny plants which are growing on the edge of the snow in the high Alps. So all of these are environments, and they try and do justice to all of them. And the reason it was developed was the following. So when you're doing bacteriology, it's very important to know where the bacteria that you are researching came from. You have the samples. Where did they come from? And so the very first databases of bacterial samples would have a column which would state the origin, where the bacteria was sampled. And if you go down the list, it contains things like male human, or female human breast, or lake in Tanzania, or underside axle of a sports car. So there was absolutely no systematic attempt to describe the environments of where bacteria are sampled. And ENVO grew out of work on solving that problem. And it's been useful for all kinds of purposes, but now its scope is really huge. Basically, it's everywhere in the universe that anything organic can survive.
It's huge.
Yes.
So yeah, I would have a question. Yesterday we talked with Jobst about it a lot. That somehow I understand that the ontology grasps reality. That's fine, but within our grasp of reality or knowledge of reality, there are things of different status, epistemic status, especially with some domain-specific ontologies. We are not so certain about them, and there is always revising them, far more perhaps than the top-level ontologies. And so, Jobst thinks that somehow it should be represented in ontology. I think maybe not in ontology, but still there should be some kind of structured way to somehow talk or represent which parts of ontology are more certain and which are less certain and more provisional. Or what would be your comment to this, epistemology of ontology?
That is actually a good question. I'm tempted to say that this kind of feature is controlled via gossip, and so that there is a feeling about particular kinds of ontology which spreads through the ontology world. But unfortunately, that gossip doesn't create a unitary response. So what is counted as a good ontology by one group may be seen as a bad ontology by another group. So I like to compare ontology to science as a whole. At any given time, there'll be areas of science which some people find questionable and can give weak support to, and other areas which are taken for granted by everybody. I think the same is true of ontology work, and the same kind of puzzles at the extremities, the penumbra of semi-acceptable ontology work on the outside, on the edges of the ontology world. So I don't have a good answer to your question, which means it's a good question.
I have another related one. So one thing we didn't discuss yesterday is that in biology, you can, in a way, get rid of the problem of showing the models. You can just say this bacterium is real and it has these components and so on. Even if that changes, well, then you later on, like with the classical example, hepatitis. First, you had hepatitis A and B, and then you had hepatitis non-A, non-B. Then it was replaced by hepatitis C. Now you also have D and E, right? So then you just update the ontology. And I think it's not worse in biology to show what is a model, where there are some cases, but not very many. But in physics, you have to, because in modern physics, you don't know anymore what the reality is.
Yeah.
So it's the domain, and we will see this tomorrow, that there are, that's why I'm so interested in ontology of physics, because in physics, we cannot say what the photon is.
Yeah.
We need the equation. and without it, but the equation is certainly not the reality, but it's a model, right? And so then you will see this tomorrow in tomorrow's session, that you have then a situation where you need to explicitly show the model as part of the ontology.
Yeah, I think that we are going to show why it is that ontology work is so successful in biology, but so weak in physics.
Yes.
We're going to give a good explanation for that.
Would you not be like a happy, because in the scholastics, we have like an Aristotle actually comes already there, that there is a distinction between like essential essence, essential knowledge, and then essential properties, and essential properties, they don't actually express what a thing is, only necessary attributes or properties following from the essence. It's kind of conflated often in modern philosophy, but I think it would be useful. So we don't know what electron is or what photon is, but we have very good grasp of its essential properties.
I don't think so. So wait for tomorrow.
Okay.
It's much so you will see. It's much more depressing than that. So but now we should continue, I think. Barry, please go ahead, and I will switch ourselves on mute and ask for the next round of questions elicited by you.
Good. All right. So then we have types of feeling in the emotion ontology. We have the laws of essence connecting feelings to other aspects of emotions, including physiological and physical tendencies. And now we need to do a little bit of history, which I'm not so keen on, but it has to be done. So when we're talking about relations among essences or species, then we're dealing with what Kant called synthetic a priori truths in many cases. So in many cases, we're dealing with empirical discoveries, but and now I have some pictures of Kant, just to remind you. So Kant had a narrow idea of the synthetic a priori. So his examples were all within the domain of mathematics and physics. So space and time causality, 7 + 5 = 12. These are his examples, and these examples recur in the Kantian literature. And so you can see that for the Munich philosophers, they had many, many more domains where synthetic a priori truths or essential laws could be identified. And actually Husserl, in looking back from Göttingen at what his Munich Göttingen followers had been doing, he looking back from his high position as a philosopher in Germany who wanted to be a leading German philosopher in the German tradition, he rather dismissed their work. He called it picture book phenomenology, where I think, that really good philosophy always requires diagrams, and the ontology, of course, is a supremely diagrammatic activity, but also that the work that the Munich people were doing with their diagrams was already there, and it is still extremely valuable in all kinds of areas. It's just either been rediscovered by analytic philosophers, or it's not yet been established as part of the philosophical literature. So there is this paper in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Salice, who's a very good specialist on the work of the Munich Göttingen phenomenologists. And he points out that there are, for the Munich phenomenologists, untold numbers of synthetic a priori truths. And we can think of them as non-inductive intelligible structures that are found in all domains of reality. And so these are examples of a prioristic micro-disciplines. And Wittgenstein worried about synthetic a priori relations among colors. The Munich phenomenologists established an a priori discipline of colorology, and then there is tonology and haptology and rational mechanics, chronometry, which is the a priori study of time, and so forth, geometry, of course. Of these, Kant just had geometry. But then there are more. The theory of speech acts itself involves huge realms of legal a priori truths, and rational psychology similarly. But now I want to move in a different direction. So I want to explore a quite different discovery of the Munich phenomenologists, a discovery which was anticipated a little bit by Husserl, but which was really documented for the first time by Reinach and by Ingarden. And this is a discovery about how things can exist in time. So for Plato, the only real things are the never changing things. We have views about the change and so forth, but these views about change never strike reality. They're always about some kind of weak image. And so for Plato, existence in time is really very boring. All the things which exist never change. Now, if you're an empiricist of the rational sort, like David Hume, or let's say of the extreme sort, then you think that the things which exist are always changing. Everything which exists belongs to the realm of what happens and is the case. So you are always changing, I'm always changing, what I say is always changing, at least at the level of air vibrations. But that's all the kind of history of the world that we have. It's this constant series of changes. So we have two sorts of history. Aristotle, I think, recognized both sorts of history. There's the unchanging history of what is ideal, and then there are the constantly changing things of causality and empirical observation. And now Reinach, I believe, made a truly important contribution to philosophy, which is still being recognized only by one or two people. Amy Thomason is one of the very few people who has recognized this in the analytic literature, alongside people who've worked on Ingarden and Reinach themselves. But the importance of this discovery is not generally recognized. So the thing is that we have in the real world ideal entities that are not part of the causal world, like Plato's ideas, but which are rooted in history because they are made by humans. And so what we have are three sorts of history. There are ideals, there are empirical reals, and then there are these things like claims and debts and laws and property rights, which Reinach talks about, which are entities in reality, but which have properties of the abstract ideal sort because they're not part of the causal order, but which yet exist in time. They have a history, they have a beginning, and they have an end. And the beginning is when they start to exist, and the end is when they stop existing. And there are many other such social entities, as we might call them. So Edith Stein drew on this idea in her treatment of law. So laws are entities of the Reinachian sort, entities of the third kind. The state itself is an entity of the third kind. And then we have more examples. We're beginning now to move into the area of what Husserl called bound idealities. So an example would be the comma. There was a time when the comma did not exist. Now it exists. Maybe there will be a time when the comma does not exist. It doesn't change at all. It's ideal. There is a universal comma, which will have lots of instances, which are shaped slightly differently all over the world in multiple piles of ink and in multiple pixel patterns and so forth. But the comma itself is an ideal entity, which yet was created at some time in history. Probably the time of creation would be impossible to establish because it was almost certainly invented in different places at different times. And then words are like this. So the word, and we can think about words in different languages. So I understand that there is a word, I don't know how to pronounce this one. Utopenec. I forgot what it means, but it's something to do with a little sausage. So the word utopenec existed from a certain point in time, and it continues to exist. It never changes. Things happen to it. It gets translated into English and so forth, but it does not change. And there are other examples. So the rules of football, they do change a little bit now and again, but here we have a kind of stepwise change. In the intervals between rule changes, we have the picture above where the rules exist and then they stop existing when we have a new change. But when they exist, they do not change. They have no causal history. The game of chess, similarly, poems, works of music, major ideologies, units of measure, and so forth. These are all examples of entities which for a long time do not exist, then they exist, and then they don't exist anymore. All of these things, of course, still exist. Soviet communism, I guess, is no longer existing, although who knows in what's happening in North Korea. All right, now, Ingarden was the first person to elaborate Reinach's ideas, focusing on the work of literature. And so we can divide phenomenology now. We have an overview. There, on the one hand, we have realist phenomenology, which includes the early Husserl, and now we're dealing with Reinach and Ingarden. If we've got time, we'll deal with Scheler down the road. And then there is what we might call the Liechtenstein school or the Salzburg-Liechtenstein school, which includes Hildebrandt, Seifert, and Crosby. Seifert and Crosby I know very well, and some of their work is good work on realist phenomenology. Then we have what might be called the Manchester School, which includes Kevin Mulligan, Peter Simons, and myself, alongside people who have nothing to do with Manchester, but do have something to do with Mulligan, Simons, and Smith, such as Dallas Willard, who was a great exponent of the logical investigations approach to philosophy, and a very famous man in his own right. And then Karl Schumann, who did so much work on the great Johannes Daubert and on Husserl, I guess I should say the even greater Husserl, and on Reinach and so forth. And then we have the West Coast phenomenology, which attempted to link realist phenomenology with analytic, semantic approaches to philosophy that we find in Frege. Then we have the transcendental phenomenology, which I won't go into, and we have the existential philosophy phenomenology, which I certainly won't go into. But these are clearly distinct from the realist phenomenology down the left. And now Ingarden had an interesting history. So he was born in Austria, of course, when Poland, that part of Poland was still part of the Austro-Hungarian realm, along with the Pope, who was also born in Austria, and whose father, if I remember correctly, was a member of the Austrian military. So Ingarden wrote most of his work at the beginning of his career in German, because that was for some unknown reason seen as an important language of philosophy. He did write some small pieces in French, but then during the Second World War, he was part of the Polish underground university, and he wrote his main work in Polish, which was not a good idea because it meant that the readership was somewhat limited. But this is probably among the top 3 or 4 contributions to metaphysics in the history of Western philosophy. And it's now finally been translated into English. And you can see the title here. And Artur Szilewicz deserves our eternal thanks for this immense work, since it is really an immense work that he had to translate. And this is the history of the translation. So we have a German translation. I'm not sure about the status of the Polish, but I'm assuming it was published. It was never finished by Ingarden. I'm assuming it's been published in Polish. was translated into German 16 years after it first appeared in Polish, and then it was translated into English only in 2013 for the first volume, and then 2016 for the second volume. For what it's worth, it was the first, a short English partial translation of the first volume that was the first work in ontology that I ever knew about. I held it in my hand for a few minutes and looked through the pages, and I saw diagrams of ontological relations. And in that instant, I became an ontologist. And then I studied Ingarden I was still in Oxford at this time. I changed my mind about what I wanted to do my PhD on, from aesthetics to ontology, and I have been doing ontology ever since. All right, so Ingarden's metaphysics is based on the idea that there are different modes of being of entities. So they can be autonomous, which means that they don't rely on other entities in order to exist, or heteronymous, which means they do rely on other entities in order to exist. And so the love between John and Mary would be heteronymous. Then they can be original or derivative. So original means that they do not require anything else to begin to exist, of which God is probably the best example. And then they can be self-sufficient or non-self-sufficient. And self-sufficient means that they make a single whole, like an object, a tennis ball. And human beings are self-sufficient in this sense, where an arm is not self-sufficient. I mean, an attached arm is not self-sufficient. And then there are dependent self-sufficient entities and independent self-sufficient entities. And when you put all of these together, you get a square structure, which in the final version has 64 different options, only about 17 of which are logically possible. And this picture shows that. You can find it documented in this paper by Grudziński. And then in the end, Ingarden reduces it to 8 possible modes of being, and the world is made up of entities belonging to all of these 8 possible modes of being, if we include number 1, which is the mode of being of God. Everything else falls short of A1. And this is a more detailed picture. I'm not going to go into the details here because it would take all week, but you get the idea. And now Ingarden showed, by looking at the logical possibilities of these combinations, what the solution was to the controversy over the existence of the world. He was interested in this controversy because his mentor and philosophical father, namely Husserl, had begun as a realist and then moved to become a kind of crazy mixed up transcendentalist. And Ingarden wanted to show that he was wrong. And so this edifice of metaphysical analysis was his methodology for showing that he was wrong. But in fact, the clearest way in which he could illustrate that Husserl was wrong was by writing this work, a work which has been much more popular than any of his other works because it's been used by many people working on the theory of literature. So the idea behind this work is that we can understand the ontological structure of what we can think of as the work of literature, whereby the work of literature, we mean now not things like this, which are books printed using ink, or which are books which are represented using pixels, rather the structure of the literary work of art. And when we think of structure now, we think of Reinach and The Promise, is a stratified structure. So when we read a work of literature, the word sounds that are associated with the words on the page go through our minds. And the meanings of those word sounds and the higher order meaning structures, in other words, the sentential meanings, the propositional meanings, go through our minds. And then when those meaning structures go through our minds, we grasp schematized aspects. For instance, that something is walking, or something is seen from the back, or something is in shadows, or something has hair, of the represented objects, which is what we're really concentrating on when we read a literary work. We're reading about Sherlock Holmes and about all the events and states of affairs in which Sherlock Holmes is involved. And that those strata, we won't consider the values here, those 4 strata constitute the literary work of art. And the crucial dimension here is the 3rd dimension, the schematized aspects, because the literary work of art, which is what we see pictured here, exists because of the tiny piles of ink on the pages of all the copies of the novels that we're reading. And those tiny piles of ink determine only a finite number of aspects. So they don't tell us when Sherlock Holmes died, or whether you could see hair growing out of his nostrils, or whether he blinked his eyes more frequently than other people. It only gives you schematized aspects. And now what Ingarden says is that if transcendental idealism is correct, namely that the world is somehow created by consciousness or by the transcendental ego, then you will necessarily have schematized aspects. But if you look at the real world, if you take a stone and measure it and test it along all possible dimensions, you will see that it has potentially infinitely many non-schematized aspects. There are no gaps. There are no loci of indeterminacy in the real world. There is loci of indeterminacy. There are loci of indeterminacy in every created world, including the created world envisioned by the transcendental idealist. So this is Ingarden's demonstration of the truth of realism, which he wrote in Polish just as Husserl was well, Husserl was no longer alive. So, and then he applied the same stratified approach to music and painting and architecture and films and so on. So this was really a very creative approach. And now I need to say one more thing about this. So when I say the literary work of art is this schematized structure, what I mean is not the processes going through your mind and my mind when we both read a certain novel, but rather the process going through all the minds of all the people who are qualified to read the novel properly. Now, this is a difficult issue to grasp, but Ingarden was old-fashioned, and so he thought that there were people who were very good at reading and who, when they were reading, created what he called concretizations, which were representative or correct for a given stage in the development of readings of that novel, because, of course, readings they're changed by the critical community and so forth. So for Ingarden, at any given time, there is a representative concretization pattern which is shared by all the people who create good readings of a given novel. There'll be differences between them, of course, but in general, there'll be a shared representation. This shared concretization, I should say, or this shared concretization pattern is the literary work of art at any given time. And that means that the literary work of art changes in time. It has a life. And it even might die if the planet is annihilated. And it had a birth, of course, when it first began to be read intelligently by readers of the novel who created these representative concretizations. And now the idea underlying idealism is that we all share a representative common concretization of this non-world which we believe exists, this noumenal, I don't know anything about Kant. We all share a common concretization because we all believe in causality and 7 + 5 = 12. But what we do not share, of course, are the potentially infinitely many qualities of this particular stone in my hand, or this other stone which I'm about to kick. And therefore, any kind of transcendental idealism is false. That's Ingarden's argument. And I just mentioned that in application to music, we don't have any represented pure music, symphonic music. We don't have any objects, aspects, or meaning units. We just have sound. So a work of music isn't about anything. It's just sound. And it's not empirical instances of sound. It's a sound formation. And this is what we call, this is on the list of what we are going to call bound idealities. All right, now, this is a work of science. So Ingarden did apply his ideas on the ontological structure of the literary work to the topic of the scientific work. And now we have a new dimension. We have representations using text and symbols. We have models, if you like. And then we have the represented objects, events, and states of affairs in the world. A full picture would be more complicated than this, of course, but this is what Ingarden teaches us about the difference between the literary work and the scientific work. And of course, he applied it also to journalism and to other kinds of what he called borderline cases of the literary work of art. And then we have here the arrow of aboutness or intentionality, which was at the core of Ingarden's account of works of science, and of course it's the core of Husserl's phenomenology. And so this repeats what I said earlier. This is the proof that idealism is false. And now Ingarden's examples in the kinds of entities which have a history of type 3 are works of art. But he now accepts that a work of art can have a life, which of course is not true for something like a law or a word, which were the examples I mentioned earlier. So his account of these entities of the third kind is different from the account which you would find if you followed Reinach. It may be closer to the account which you would find if you followed Edith Stein, because of course a state has a life as more state administrators and judges are appointed and laws changed and so on. But the idea is still the same. These are not entities which belong to the realm of what happens and is the case, the causal realm, and they're certainly not ideal entities a la Plato. All right. But now Ingarden goes further. He starts to do biology. And some of his works in this connection are collected together in this book called Man and Value, which is also translated by the great Shilevich. So this is where Ingarden develops his conception of the world in terms of systems. And he talks more precisely of partially isolated systems. So these are partially open and at the same time partially isolated or shielded systems which interact. They're segregated from each other, but they're interlinked. And so organisms are relatively isolated systems in this sense, and they're isolated through surrounding membranes. So the skin for a human and the hide for many animals, which is itself a complex organ, composed of many layers and has many functions in life processes. And it forms a boundary between the body and everything else, though it's a permeable membrane, which means it's only relatively isolated. So it allows us to sweat, for instance, when we get hot. So this is a picture. I like pictures. So we have the relatively isolated system, which is the human being, as you can see, and then the membrane around it, which has various apertures, such as your ears and your mouth. And there are other relatively isolated systems with which it interacts. But in the world, Ingarden says, there are no absolutely open and no absolutely closed systems. Now, I'm not quite sure that that is the case. He talks about empty space between objects, which itself forms a partial isolator that can give rise to partially isolated systems. He says can give rise, which suggests that there are some absolutely open or absolutely closed systems, although they can, of course, if galaxies move in specific ways, give rise to systems which are partially closed and partially open. All right, so that all of these systems, now we have systems on Earth like pipes, plumbing and wires for electricity and postal services, wireless communication systems, the internet and AI and all such things like that. These are interlinking you and me together all the time so that the interlinkages between the partially isolated systems, which are you and me, are becoming more and more elaborate and interesting all the time. And now it starts very early on. So the developing embryo and fetus is a relatively isolated system within the mother. It's not a part of the mother, as is evident from looking at this or looking at its counterpart, where the egg-shaped part of the diagram is in fact an egg, because we're dealing with a chicken or some other egg, or with a kangaroo indeed, where the egg-shaped part of this diagram is replaced by a pouch. In each case, the developing embryo fetus is not a part of the mother, and but it is linked through the placenta in all kinds of wonderful ways to the mother. But that doesn't mean it's part of the mother. It's contained inside the mother in non-kangaroo type cases, but it's not a part of the mother. And the reason why I'm going into such detail is because I want to point to this paper where this idea that the embryo and the fetus are contained within but not a part of the mother has been attacked of late in an entire literature which claims that the fetus is a part of the mother, and therefore all kinds of implications about the ethics of mother-child relations follow. And in this literature, this paper is attacked over and over again for having claimed that the relationship between the fetus and the mother is one of containment rather than parthood. And all right, to go back to Ingarden, so he just says that we have at lower and lower levels more and more systems, all the way down to the molecular level, which are partially interconnected and partially segregated. And so he creates a list. So we have the nervous system, the system of inner secretion, the blood as body's warmth regulator, in other words, the blood system, defensive system, the immune system. I'm not sure of the quality of his biology here. Then we have information systems of sensation, deep sensation, which are highly complex, and threshold of consciousness systems, systems of storage and transmission of information, which are memory and language. And these are pictures. And and then he comes to the ego. So the ego is not on his list earlier, and I'm not sure I like the word ego, but I think I have an identity, and I have a stream of experiences, and I am aware that this stream of experiences is mine, and I think I probably prefer the word psyche to refer to it, but it's different from, but somehow connected to the body, which sustains this psyche in existence, and which also, of course, is responsible for reproduction. And Ingarden asks the question, could these be conceived as elements of a single system? Now, from a philosophical point of view, that's an interesting question, given all that we saw in the 19th century in terms of grand philosophical schemes, I mean, in the 18th century already. or in the 17th century already, grand philosophical themes which made a problem out of the fact that, as was obvious to Scheler, for instance, who was, as I said, one of the great figures, great influential figures in the Munich school, it was obvious to Scheler very early on that these are just one system. All right, so this is how Ingarden pictures this one system. So we have the system of conscious awareness. We have what he calls the soul. I'm not sure why he puts this in sneer quotes, but this is where raw sensations and emotions and so forth. This is where changes in muscle tone are steered from. And then we have the physical body, which includes the muscles and so forth. And so Ingarden goes through in great detail what I think are very interesting observations about the mechanisms at work from one system to another in the human being. But the one interesting one is in Polish, so I was able to extract this much for our present purposes. It will become clear in a minute why I am going into such depth about all of these systems inside Ingarden and inside Ingarden's work. So then we have systems of external senses, systems of deep sensations, threshold of consciousness systems, storage and transmission systems. Everything here, if I'm right, is physical. But we don't understand it. In other words, we don't understand the relationship between these systems and the more obviously physical systems in the body. And this is one of the features, we believe, in the book on AI that Jobst and I published, and which has just appeared in a second edition, called Why Machines Will Never Rule the World. So we emphasize that the brain is physical, but so also is consciousness, which are processes in the brain. It's just that we don't understand the relationship between the consciousness system and the brain and its physical systems. And now we get to language, and we can language is one of the ways in which we break out of our own system and form systems which involve other people. So conversations are really important. And we don't understand either our ability to engage in conversations. This is a tremendous ability which AI systems of today, for all their brilliant greatness, don't have any idea how to deal with. That's why there are no successful chatbots, as you will know from calling your bank and being answered by a computer. All right, so we have isolators, which are the membrane and so forth around your body. And then we have neutralizers, which are protective, but which also enable perception through the membrane. So walls and windows in the building, sunglasses, which protect you from the sun's rays, suits of armor, which of course you always wear when you go out of doors in case there are enemies waiting to kill you. And these neutralize the dangers in the outside world. And we can view all of these systems. This is all Ingarden that I'm repeating now. We can view these systems from physics, and we have objects that interact with each other. We have systems with different types of elements, systems which are built out of physical elements, systems which are built out of a mixture of physical and non-physical elements, such as the human being, maybe. And then we have types of systems which are simple systems and complex systems. And this is the topic which is the central axis of our book on AI, namely the difference between simple systems and complex systems. And now I'm moving away from Ingarden for a minute, but we'll come back to him. So there are natural systems such as the solar system and the human cognitive system, and then there are artificial systems such as the New York Stock Exchange. And the New York Stock Exchange is in fact a hybrid system because it involves both human beings and machines. And similarly, the Milan subway system is a hybrid system of this sort. And so these are the elements of the New York Stock Exchange. the humans and the computers, the neurological systems of the humans, which of course have trillions of elements, which are all the molecules and submolecular structures in your brain, which AI people are busily mapping now to no great effect. And there's information on computer screens, and all of these elements are governed by physical forces. So when a fingertip on a broker hits a key on his computer, then this triggers electromagnetic processes and light waves from other computer screens, which trigger brain activity in the minds of other brokers, which lead to ion fluxes and protein conformation changes in their neurons, and ultimately to what we call selling or buying decisions. And so a general feature of systems, as we see, is that they're embedded within larger systems. And systems represent those. So we pick out systems to do science, to understand something. And so the systems that we pick out reflect our choices. The systems themselves exist independently, but the systems we pick out are, in a sense, fiat entities. They're demarcated by our fiat choices, or by the fiat choices of physicists, or molecular biologists, or cell biologists, or sociologists, or astronomers, and then every system has a granular flaw, which means that there is some smallest element which are recognized in that system, whether it's molecules or train carriages or whatever you're dealing with in your particular system-focused activities. And then there are chaotic systems, with the way mushroom spores grow in the forest, which we can't predict. And which we can't predict because we can't measure the starting conditions with sufficient exactness to enable prediction. They are called chaotic systems. All of this is discussed in our book. And these are the properties of complex systems which we identify in our book. And I can summarize by saying these are properties which mean that it's impossible for us to predict the behavior of complex systems. And because most complex systems in the world most systems in the world are complex, then AI systems can't predict their behavior, which is why AI systems are good for some kinds of short-term predictions, but they fail when it comes to many other kinds of predictions. And now I can leave him out and we can do some Scheler. So Scheler was a big influence in Wojtyła. That's one of the reasons why Scheler is so important. So Scheler was, in a complex way, a religious man. And members of the Munich school, including the Krakow branch of the Munich school, were supremely religious in different ways, complex ways. So Reinach's sister, on his very tragically early death in the First World War, became a nun in a way which Reinach played a role. And now Scheler then develops an ontology which includes values and feelings and an intrinsic relationship between values and feelings, in that he thought that we could directly perceive values via feelings. And then he had an ontology of different kinds of feelings, and so we can have a diagram of this ontology. This is a diagram of the emotions which correspond down the right. Sorry, a diagram of the values down the right, which correspond to the feeling states down the left. So we have spiritual feeling states which enable us to apprehend or perceive or grasp the values of the holy and the unholy. We have psychic feeling states which enable us to grasp mental values. And I guess one example of a psychic feeling state would be when you feel that you're being lied to. And then we have lived body feeling states which give rise to vital values like fitness. And then sensual feeling states which give rise to values of agreeableness, and a subtype of those values are utility values, such as economic and political values. Scheler says. And so this is the pyramid of values: utility, virtue, wisdom, and the sacred. And all of this is documented in a gigantic work published in Husserl's Jahrbuch called Formalism in Ethics, a non-formal ethics of values. By formalism, he meant Kant, which he didn't like. And that says it here. So the categorical imperative is exactly the wrong way to understand values, says Scheler. The way we understand values is based on our feelings. So we feel that something is good. And then there are some people who suffer from value blindness. They don't have these feelings, psychopaths, for instance. Okay, now we come to Wojtyła. Now, Wojtyła is the reason why I spent so much time on the layers of systems in the human person defined by Ingarden. So Wojtyła was a friend of Ingarden's, and he was also tremendously influenced by Scheler. So his habilitation was on Scheler and Thomas. Since as a good Catholic, his work had to be rooted in Thomism. And so there is this phenomenological Thomist tradition of which Wojtyła is the apogee, if you like. And this is presented in his book, Person and Act. I've forgotten the Polish title. This book was subject to some controversy in its translation, but the new translation is not controversial. And it's about person and act because it's about persons and how they act. And we can see, well, Ingarden is not on this picture, but Ingarden plays a role too. You see that I like pictures. It's probably a fault in my character. So, Wojtyła, originally the translation was called The Acting Person, but now we have Person and Act. And it's a study of the human person as a substance in the Aristotelian sense, as an organism in the biological sense, and as an individual in the Thomist phenomenological sense, let's say, or the ordinary everyday common sense. And then the structures or strata, we can think in Ingardenian terms here, common to all persons and to all human action. And so on the one hand, there is what merely happens in a person. So that is not an action. So if you get kicked by somebody by accident, or you fall over and something happens, you're shocked by some sudden noise, that's not an action. But contrasting with what merely happens in a person are spontaneous doings where we choose, and which could be external when we have a mental act, or external when we kiss somebody or kick somebody. And then speech acts are included under this second category. They are doings, how to do things with words, as contrasted with cries of pain and other non-spontaneous, this is a technical term in both Reinach and Wojtyła, non-spontaneous action. Spontaneous means caused either internally or externally by the person. And this actually is called Reinach, action versus passion. And now for Wojtyła, we have this axiom, which will be familiar to some people interested in Austrian economics, namely the axiom, man acts, according to which the person, the human being, is a dynamic center of spontaneous acts. And then there is a range of different dynamic orders. Now, these will correspond to different layers in Ingarden's account of the layers of the human organism, in which each person is involved and which each person must somehow integrate through the choices he makes through his life. So persons create themselves by acting. So, but acting is only the first of many dynamisms in the structure of the human person. Acting is conscious. And consciousness is one of those levels in Ingarden's list of strata. There are also bodily dynamisms. So the blood circulation is a merely bodily dynamism. And then Wojtyła's question is, how is this multiplicity of dynamisms unified through actions? How do we make ourselves in a unified way? I should mention, when you're reading this book, you are thinking all the time, now when will Jesus Christ enter? And he never enters. So this is a book which, in some interesting sense, is a contribution to philosophy. It's not the kind of book that you would expect from a pope. So consciousness mirrors reality, he says. When we act, we experience our action. Now, what that means is that we have internal perception of how we're acting. And this is another topic which is very important in our book. AI doesn't have a distinction between internal perception and external perception. In fact, it doesn't have perception at all, of course. It has some some simulations of patterns in data, which is obtained by taking videos or recordings in one way or another of the way people act. But it doesn't act, it doesn't have a consciousness of its own action, it doesn't have an internal consciousness or an external consciousness of its own action because it doesn't have any kind of consciousness. So we are conscious of ourselves as the agent. We reflect upon certain conscious processes in ourselves. So we have consciousness of consciousness. And specifically, we reflect upon those consciousness processes in ourselves, which are called desires. So the desires play a central role here because, as he puts it, there are the desires are bearers of moral value or disvalue. So they're part of a drama of good and evil within ourselves. And we're obviously, if we're going to shape ourselves through time, we're going to try and fight on the side of good in this drama. And so as we experience our action, we are reflecting also, as it were, from the inside on the actions of the person whose consciousness it is. So we're reflecting not only on our own consciousness, our inner perception, we're also reflecting on our actions, not just as physical actions, but also from the point of view of this drama of good and evil. And that means, in part, reflecting and being intertwined with, or entwined with, I like the word intervolved, but no one else likes it. So with the external reality in which the action takes place. So we're reflecting in every action, in principle at least, on many things, on our own action as a physical thing, on our own action as a willed thing, on our own action as it appears to ourselves from the inside. We'll be reflecting upon its intertwinement or intervolvement with external reality, for instance, the other people who may be joining us with our actions or who may be targeted by our actions and so on. And this goes hand in hand now with the dynamism of feelings and emotions. So we will have emotions as we consciously realize what we're doing, but we will also feel for the emotions of others who are involved. This is what Edith Stein's big book on empathy is all about. And we will be evaluating our actions, our consciousness, our desires, and so forth. So we're going to be assigning different degrees of valuableness and non-valuableness to our emotions. And our cognitive consciousness can grasp these same values and reflect upon them. And then that's where we get the task of bringing about a unity of the person through diminution of the strife to which our awareness of values would otherwise give rise. So we're trying to compress the range of the values that we feel, both in ourselves and in others, so that there is a lesser and lesser conflict between the values that we experience. And then some people are over-emotionalized, which means that their consciousness is confused. so that consciousness loses out. We get so angry that we're not thinking about what we're doing. And then, as Wojtyła says, the person as unity disintegrates. We're no longer holding it together. And then there's freedom. So every action, he says, involves in principle an experience of freedom in principle. And if you get really angry, then of course you lose that experience of freedom. And of course, we don't know what freedom is. We don't even know, and this is another theme in our book on AI, we don't know if we have freedom, but we certainly have the experience of freedom. But we don't understand where that comes from either, if we're thinking about the physics or the neurology of the brain. So, but Wojtyła knows a lot about the experience of freedom, and he's thought very deeply about the experience of freedom. And so, in order to have the experience of freedom, you need, he says, a relatively low degree of emotionalization of your consciousness and a relatively high degree of integration of your personal experiences. Because to experience freedom, you have to experience the I may, but I need not. And he says only such a person is free. So I think Jobst and I would say only such a person has the experience of freedom. This experience presupposes self-possession. And self-possession presupposes the cognitive awareness that my decisions are contributing to the integration or unification of my person. So this is a pretty tough demand if you want to have the experience of freedom. And then he goes on. I think I'm going to be summarizing Wojtyła for the next few minutes. So you can be living in error. So in order to have the experience of freedom, you have to have a reference to the object which elicit your actions. You have to be living in truth, as he would say. And what that means, of course, has to be worked out. So there is a dynamism which makes us consciously aware and receptive to value in the outer world, constantly choosing and deciding, moving in this way and that in relation to outer objects. But then there is a similar parallel dynamism in the inner world, and this is the big jump in the whole book. This is a receptivity to inner value, which is called conscience. So we haven't talked about conscience yet, but it's conscience which serves to control the goodness or badness of our actions. And of course, a confused consciousness, a horrible anger which breaks the unity of your consciousness, cannot experience conscience. Conscience serves to control the goodness or badness of our action. And he then says it serves to control the degree to which our acts of will are such as to respect the truth. And that's another big step in the book. So this is Wojtyła's solution to the mind-body problem. So the mental and bodily dynamisms are brought to a unity on the higher level constituted by these dynamisms of human action, dynamisms of conscience, and of all the other things I've referred to. And I'm sure he doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty, but it does correspond to a lot of what Merleau-Ponty has to say when he's talking about the cultivation of bodily skills through work and practice. So a skill like swimming or piano playing is acquired through lots of practice. And Wojtyła is saying that we can acquire psychologico-bodily skills through work and practice in acting. And acting then involves all of the layers of consciousness and of value feeling and of conscience and of seeking the truth that I've been referring to. So, and Wojtyła says all men, and he means, of course, all human beings, have the ability to use consciousness in order to distinguish truth, conscience, in order to distinguish truth from falsity as far as their own acts are concerned. And he says to do this infallibly. Now, this was a view embraced also by Brentano. I'm not sure that I go all the way with Wojtyła on this, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis. And that's the end of Wojtyła. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about Galen, but this may be a good time to pause for questions.
Yes, indeed, some have accumulated. But before I ask my questions, are there any of the students who want to go first? So maybe I give you some time to think and ask one of them. So if you go back 2 slides, Barry, the first question concerns Wojtyła. So most of this is totally Schillerian, right? To be honest, the whole thing with the acts and the person, but this here is very interesting because it's Thomistic. So that someone who is living in error is not free. This is very, very. You don't find this in Scheler, and you don't find this in the Protestant philosophical tradition, because Protestant thinker would say that we all live all the time in error, right? And then we could never be free. And so this is very interesting because it supposes, and it's very Catholic, because it supposes that you can live outside the error and can become free. And the same applies to what is said on the next slide, that you can climb up the ladder of virtue, which also an idea from Thomas. So just as a comment here, I think that's the most interesting part, because here you can see how Catholic ideas are fused with phenomenology. I find this quite fascinating because, for example, it's a typical phenomenological idea that you can cultivate bodily skills, how Mello describes it, and you have this also in Scheler a lot, but that you can also practice virtue is unthinkable from a Protestant perspective. So this is very interesting because it is so Catholic, and that so in a way here Jesus enters the book. Also when you go to the next slide, and it says that conscience can always yes, this view is also very Catholic. So here you can see and very clearly the Catholic aspect of this, and it's very fascinating because in Scheler you also have a bit of religiosity, but Scheler, he was first a Protestant, then atheist, then again Catholic, so he was kind of oscillating. But here you have very clearly the strong Catholic flavor, and I've never seen this before, so thank you, that's very interesting. But that's more comments, right?
Yeah, and I should make the comment for the audience that Jobst Landgrebe comes from a long line of distinguished Landgrebe theologians.
Oh, Hochstädter, my mother.
Hochstädter, okay. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's true. So now the real question I have is the following. So that refers to Ingarden. So Ingarden, I think, attributes to idealism that idealism sees entities as created by the mind, and then he says, but then they can only be schemata, but they are not, right? Now, I think that certainly in Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, there's still the givenness through intentionality, which is not at all saying that we are inventing the things. But even the late Husserl, Erfahrung und Urteil, one of his last texts he wrote, he describes very clearly, for example, variational intentionality as giving rise to fulfillment. And so I don't think that this attribution applies at all to Husserl, because Husserl was very much aware. So it applies only insofar maybe to the part when Husserl highlights the importance of human mind for the formation of contents of the mind. But that's still not an act of invention, like the author of literary work of art creates a schematized version of a person that lacks a lot of contents because it has all these Leerstellen that Ingarden describes. So I think it's unfair to attribute this to Kant or Husserl. But of course, you can attribute this to the radical poietic idealists, right? Like Schelling or Hegel. But it's certainly the realist, critical realists. And I see Kant and Husserl like this. To this, it does not apply. It's like a strawman argument saying, oh, they have this theory and now it's wrong because it creates a schema. But actually, both Kant and Husserl would never say this, right? Even the late Husserl would not. this is, or how do you see this? So do you see this as a fair point, or do you think so that it's only applying to the radical idealists like Berkeley or Hegel, or do you think it also applies to Husserl?
So this is a long story. I point only to one piece of evidence that you can take it or leave it. So one of Carl Schumann's more interesting papers was about how Husserl saw himself in the history of German philosophy. And he shows how at various turning points in his life, he starts to use phrases and self-descriptions which tease him in the direction of being in the tradition of Kant and other great names in the German philosophical tradition. So there certainly was a dimension in Husserl which was pointing not in the direction of truth, but in the direction of eternal fame.
I mean, being in the tradition of Kant is not so bad. What is bad is
No,
being
I
in the
say
tradition of Hegel.
I leave it without comment.
I mean, maybe to put this in another way. So I think Husserl oscillated after he quote unquote discovered the epoche. He oscillated between realism and idealism, but
Yeah,
I don't think
I agree. And we've talked about this. So
yeah, okay. Good, but I don't think that the argument that you summarized applies to him. It applies certainly to radical idealists.
yeah, okay.
But not to him, because Husserl was certainly not a radical idealist. Otherwise, I said
well,
it.
except
Okay, anyhow.
Ingarden saw it as applying to him.
Okay, and with this, I would really disagree.
Yeah.
Okay, now any other questions now related to this segment about Ingarden and Wojtyla? Yes, please come here.
Brought this. Hi again.
Yeah, hello.
It's a very short question. If you could describe more, I was amazed by the sentence that you said about reading literature and books, about people being qualified for reading.
Yeah.
And also about the word, I needed to write it down because I I did not know if I understood it right. And also about the work of music, that there was on the slide written that it is nothing. And I don't know if I understood it right in which sense, if you could draw more.
It should have said the work of music is about nothing.
About nothing.
It may be that
So
I
it's
have a
not
misprint there.
No.
So that's the music question. With regard to the readership question, that is truly a weak point in Ingarden's approach. So Ingarden was very old-fashioned. He believed in a world where civilization would train people in school how to read, and where literary critics would help to enhance the readings that people engaged in when they were engaging with literature, and where the range of kinds of literature was radically narrow. Basically, the 19th century novel of manners is Ingarden's paradigm for what a work of literature should be. So it should be written in such a way that we can all follow it, that it follows human emotions, which we can all recognize. It has all the characteristics of a good novel. It has a well-rounded ending. It leaves messages for that we can profit from, and so forth. So Jane Austen or something like that. And in such a world, which of course we've left far behind, people are just not trained to read anymore. There is a kind of pattern associated with each novel, and people can reproduce this pattern if they belong to the literate classes, more or less instinctively. They don't need training. And they share their experiences with others. They read newspaper reviews and so forth. So in that kind of a world, a kind of dream world, Probably Jobst still lives in that kind of a world.
I would like to comment on this a lot.
Yeah.
So basically, the tradition to which Ingarden here refers is very long, and a very prominent exponent is Stendhal, who wrote Rouge et Noir and Chartreuse de Parme. These are two novels in the sense. Barry gave a British example. I'm giving a French one. And
I would give you Mann ohne Eigenschaften.
Yeah, but but that's actually not at all in the scope because it
no, that's a bit tricksy.
Yeah, but let me finish. So, and Stendhal, at the end of La Chartreuse de Parme, which is really an absolutely great novel, it says in English, it's written in French, but it says in English, to the happy few. And what Stendhal wants to say by this is that most people will not be able to read and appreciate this novel, which is true. So he believes in an eliticist view of readers that only some readers can appreciate this high work of art. And it's one of the top 20 best novels ever written. It's a super subtle work of art, full of wonderful pictures and ideas, great characters. And also, for example, he describes the Battle of Waterloo. But it's described in a totally modernist sense. The participants themselves don't know what's going on. So it's a very, very good way of how it must be to be in this battle, right? It's a super modern view of this battle. And this is just an example. It's full of this. But what Ingarden is pointing at is that there's only certain type of readers can appreciate this. Most readers will be bored and put the novel away. Mm. And so the people who are able and willing to, the happy few who are able and willing, they create the eternal life of these works of art by reading them and talking about them. That's what he means. And I think this still exists, Barry. However, in our mainstream culture, has been to a certain extent pushed aside, right? But I believe it still exists.
What is the name of the novel?
Yeah, La Chartreuse de Parme.
The Charterhouse of Parma.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And you could also, I think, if you want to read a simpler one, it's also it's Red and Black, yes. which is more known. But La Chartreuse de Parme is more sublime. But I'm giving this example because this is the mentality of how Stendhal saw his readers and so on. And I think this still exists. These happy few still exist. There are at the moment, however, not anymore
very
so much.
Very few.
No, they are not so much dominating. In the time of Ingarden, they dominated the public discourse, right? So think of all these figures who wrote the feuilletons of the European journals, right? At that time, and they were very much, there was a community of intellectuals that was very different from today. And that's where this is coming from. So I don't think it is outdated, Barry.
There is still the feuilleton in Germany.
Yeah, you can forget about it, unfortunately. Now for example, now you can read lengthy articles and Kant was a racist there. So I'm not reading it anymore.
That was it. I am going to write a novel.
Good idea. Any other questions, or shall we move on and do another philosopher of the school with Barry's help?
I may have still like a comment, Good. Then maybe a question, but the comment is that actually talking about this theological aspect, that there is one also interesting dimension of a difference between Protestant and Catholic understanding of original sin, the kind of effects why humans are flawed. So whereas in the Catholic tradition, it does not actually go into the cognitive part. So humans are capable of truth, and so they can get to know the truth, even though they have problems with affective will and emotion, sensuality, and so on. But in the Protestant tradition, it goes both in the affective aspect. So we are living in the sin, we cannot improve, but we are also incapable of truth, actually.
I know that's actually Luther would say that this is basically out of scope. So he would say if you are possessed by evil, then you cannot see the truth anymore, right?
Exactly.
But he would say that the question of truth and falsehood in the sense of lying, this is still in scope of theological thinking, but philosophical question of truth and falsehood are out of scope. So he makes it very clear. So he eliminates all philosophical questions from his thinking about the relationship of man and God, which is very Paul-like, because Paul also rejects all of this. He only concentrates basically on the cross and the resurrection and how it defines our relationship to God. And all the philosophical things get excluded, whereas the Catholic tradition, since Plotinus and Origenes, has merged philosophical perspectives and theological perspectives. And true Protestants reject this, and they say, no, the question of truth and falsehood, lying is a different thing because it's interwoven with emotions. It's about when it's everywhere with facts, But truth and false in the philosophical sense are separated in Luther's, and that's a big difference. It's hard to understand for Catholics, and I'm not saying this ironically or out of a feeling of superiority, right? But Protestants, Luther has purged this out, like he made the churches ugly, but taking away all the nice stuff that you have in there, right? He also made theology ugly, in a way, because he took out all the fun stuff that you Catholics have in. So it's a very dry affair.
So maybe there is some kind of influence on phenomenology, some kind of subconscious influence on phenomenology that is maybe more closer to Catholic.
I don't think so.
No?
Certainly that's true.
That's true of the Munich school, at least.
It's true of Husserl himself. I mean, Husserl is a Jew, but he was raised in a Catholic environment, right? So I think Brentano and Bolzano and the whole Austrian tradition he's a member of is a Catholic tradition. So it's absolutely true what you're saying.
What Barry said is also quite a good distinction, like true of the Munich school, because I think I've heard somewhere that Edith Stein, did not like Sein und Zeit. And she said that it's like a philosophy of bad conscience, So that as if this later phenomenology is more going in this corrupt,
I don't think it's phenomenology.
You can go even.
Okay. Very good, Barry. So please go ahead now with and a bit of what did you do? Arnold Gehlen now.
Yeah,
it's Arnold Gehlen. Yeah, I think that's a very good way to end. I mentioned him also yesterday several times, so let's listen to that.
Good. So Gehlen is regarded as belonging to the school of philosophical anthropology in the interwar years, and the founder of this school was Scheler. And to that degree, since Scheler was the Haupt- und Prunk member of the Munich school, Gehlen can be regarded as being a kind of fellow traveler of the Munich school. And he certainly was a great realist philosopher, but he was a very phenomenological philosopher. A very anthropological philosopher. He devoted his work to studies of anthropological themes, which in a way is in keeping with the Munich idea that one should investigate domain ontologies rather than formal ontologies. And another reason why we mention it here is because Jobst and I deal with Gehlen's ideas quite thoroughly in our book on AI. And so the connections between Gehlen's ideas and the question whether an AI system can have a will, these questions we approach from a very Gahlenian perspective. All right, so Gehlen's main work in English is translated as Man, His Nature and Place in the World. Of course, in German, Mensch, it doesn't have the same connotations as man now has in English, but it did then have the same connotations. And so the Mensch is nature and his place in the world. And a very important part of this is the drive of man, so Antriebsgesetze. And the background, as I say, is Scheler. There is some influence of American pragmatism, both through Scheler and directly. And Gehlen's focus of work was in what was then called philosophical anthropology. I don't believe that there is such a discipline today, but it certainly was an important feature of German philosophy at that time. So Gehlen's main thesis has to do with his idea that humans are deficient. And the reason is that we lack the instincts which guide the behavior of animals. And the reason why we lack those instincts is because at important phases in our history, we were forced to move out of our ancestral environments. So the idea is that an animal can rely on its instincts to survive and indeed to be very powerful within its ancestral environment only if it remains in its ancestral environment. But if your ancestral environment begins to freeze over, then you need to move to a new environment. And in moving to new environments in situations like that, human beings lost their instincts, or most of their instincts. So we retain some instincts in the realm of sexual reproduction, for instance, but most of the other instincts we no longer have, which means that we have weak sensory abilities and weak motor abilities. But we make up for that by changing our environments. We adapt our environment to our needs by building houses and walls and so forth, where other animals adapt themselves as best they can to their environments. And what this means is that man is a cultural being by nature. So he has a deficient natural environment, but that is he has a deficient natural endowment, but that is compensated by cultivating our environments. And where other species can survive only in their ancestral environment, we are open. We are marked by world openness, and we can adapt to new environments, but we can even create new environments like submarines, for instance, or spaceships, or hotels, or railway train carriages, and so forth. And now another way in which we adapt to this world openness is via language. So we use our language, and this is a theme from Reinach and also a theme from Austin and Searle. We use our language to guide our own behavior and to guide others' behavior. So one way in which we do this is to make plans. In order to make plans, and these would be plans for an entire family or group, we need language. And in order to make those plans realizable, we need to have ways of conserving our language over generations. And that gave rise to things like wills and testaments, which enable people to use language to govern what happens even when they're dead. And now another way in which humans compensate for this world openness is by what Galen calls excess drive. Now, we have an ability of self-control, which means that we can tame our behavior to match environments, for instance, social environments in which we live. But we also have excess drive, which means drive which goes much further than we need in order to survive in the environments which we live. So building skyscrapers with 200 floors is an example of excess drive. Writing operas which take 11 hours to perform is an example of excess drive. Any of the extreme cultural creations of human beings are products of excess drive as Galen sees it. And of course, excess drive can lead to good things, like, for instance, plumbing systems across entire countries. But it can also lead to bad things like wars and so forth, caused by politicians with excess drive. And so the important thing is that we can create entirely new worlds. Chess is an entirely new world. And ISO tells, we now have digital choirs which have 15,000 voices which are merged together in one rather beautiful sound. We didn't have that even 5 years ago. I mentioned submarines. Mathematics is a new world that we've created. And we're now creating a new world of, well, they call it artificial intelligence. We're also creating astrobiology, which is the study of biological phenomena which may or may not be present in other parts of the galaxy. So these are all new worlds. Some of them are more or less real. And so humans have hobbies, they have passions, they have obsessions, and all of these are ways in which we are inventing or participating in new worlds caused through excess drive. And now the interesting thing about excess drive is that there is here, and in human life generally, no tendency towards equilibrium. So if you look at an animal environment, then as long as the prey or the food source is sufficient for continued existence, what they do is they continue to exist. They do the same things over and over again. Human life, as I would say, Galen probably didn't use this expression, is one damn thing after another. So you're all now sitting in some room with a screen in front of you, listening to someone else 3,000 miles away, talking about listening to someone else 3,000 miles away. And so no one ever did that before, I guess. But now we'll go on and do something else. So we'll look at the next slide. And then you'll go home and you'll feed the animals, or I don't know. So, and then Galen applies all of this to institutions. So one of the ways in which we create new worlds is to create new kinds of institutions and new kinds of social and cultural norms that go hand in hand with belonging to institutions. And so Galen, in one of Galen's characteristic phrases, he says that compared to most animals, humans are unfinished at birth. So after birth, the mother has to work very hard to ensure organic development occurs, and the family more generally. And then we have schooling, and we have peer pressure, and all the other things that are supposed to lead to stable social structures and to the single human being programmed to fit into those stable social structures which around him or her and which enabled him to develop to maturity, for instance, by going to university. And now there are so many stimuli being created by all of these many institutions, by the new worlds that we create, that we are overwhelmed. So we are too free for our own good. So in the olden days, culture produced forms which gave coherence and continuity to human life in ways which compensated for the lack of instincts, which are what gave continuity and coherence to the animals' lives. But now we have so many opportunities that we don't have this coherence and continuity anymore. For many parts of our various societies, we have a failure in coherence and continuity. So we have crime, and we have terrorism, and we have things like that. So, but that doesn't mean that we are somehow not cultural beings. So he says, no matter how primitive we may find them, even the most primitive cultures enjoy a cultural level of human existence. And this is a thesis which we also emphasize in the book, a thesis about the commonality of common sense across all human cultures. So our common sense is what it is which enables us to exist. We have common sense knowledge, for instance, about reproduction. We have common sense knowledge about how to build and use shelter. We have common sense knowledge about how to treat our children, how to raise our children. All of this is common to all cultures. It will differ in certain flavors, and it will differ in certain non-commonsensical associations. So in our Western culture, common sense will be associated by a belief in or an interest in physics or something like that, which is not part of common sense. In a more primitive culture, our common sense may be associated with a belief in predestination. So the recurrence of your life in another form in the future, or some other complicated religious belief set. But that's not part of common sense. That's part of what we might call secondary theory rather than the primary theory of common sense. And that terminology comes from another anthropologist, Robin Horton. He was an English anthropologist who worked most of his life on African cultures. And he came to the conclusion that common sense is indeed a universal across all cultures. So, as Galen puts it, the distinction between natural man and cultural man is imprecise only cultured humanity exists, though with an astounding range of cultural inventory. So the different kinds of houses, the different kinds of practices in forming social harmony and so forth, that massive range. But the existence of cultured humanity in the primary theory sense is nonetheless universal. And then corresponding to the distinction between what we might think of as normal human drive versus excess drive, we also have the opposition between what Galen calls morality and hypermorality. So maybe I can call on Jobst to give a quick account of the opposition between morality and hypermorality.
Yeah, so this is so Schelen had two big books on anthropology. The first was Man, the other one was Urmensch und Spätkultur, which means primordial man and modern culture, where he basically contrasts the primordial man and the social. This is his book about institutions, essentially. And then he wrote a big book on art, which is not so well known, but a delightful book on modern art. And then he wrote his last book is Morality and Hypermorality, which was never translated to English. And it's a book which is where you can see very much. So the subtitle is Towards a Pluralistic Ethics. And with this, so he picks up Scheler's phenomenological theory of ethics, whereby there are different values that are a priori idealities and that can be felt, which we saw a bit earlier. And now the individual moral profile of a person consists in the mix of values that this person prefers. So for example, there might be somebody who prefers formal justice, he might become a judge. Another person prefers justice towards the environment, might become an environmental activist, right? And so this is pluralism of values, he says, and this is morality. Healthy morality arises from pluralism of values within one person. So one person needs to be able to feel many values, and then you have a mature personality. And then he says hypermorality arises when you only have one sole virtue or value on which you concentrate completely, not a preference, but really it's excessive. And he says that modern society, Western society at the time when he wrote, and he gives very good example, was already excessively concentrating on the value of Nächstenliebe. What is it in English again, Barry?
Loving your neighbor.
Yes, loving your neighbor, which is a traditional Christian value. However, he describes a process according to which this virtue has now been enlarged and is not anymore directed towards the people you encounter naturally in your own life, which is the meaning, how the New Testament describes it, how when Christ asks to love your neighbor, he means the person you encounter in your everyday life. And Christ himself gives examples. You should, for example, Lazarus, right, is an example. Even if he's belonging to a foreign tribe or enemy tribe, you should still love this person and take care of this person. But it's always in your own. It's not an abstract love of the neighbor, but it's in your own vicinity. And because Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, so the man Jesus was concerned, and of course Christianity then as well, with encountering God in the other person you encounter, which is one of the most beautiful messages of New Testament. And Gale now says that this has been forgotten and expanded to say that you should love the entire world, but not the people you encounter, but on a theoretical level.
Make military interventions.
No, for example, have nations without borders, which are not nations anymore, because everybody can migrate, because everybody should get the social welfare state and so on. And you could also say humanitarian interventions, but interestingly, he calls already this virtue signaling, which is a modern expression, because he says that the people who propose this hypermorality, they don't act anymore in loving their neighbor whom they encounter in their everyday life. So they shut themselves off, and they don't do any concrete acts of charity anymore, because the acts of charity are, according to Thomas, but also according to Protestant view, an expression of loving the neighbor. They don't do acts of charity anymore, but maybe they fund some NGOs, which then smuggle people into the country, right? And so this is kind of he was one of the first philosophers to see that this would be a big problem of the West long before it became a huge social problem, right? He just saw it in the culture and predicted that it would have very dire consequences. And then immediately Habermas framed him as Nazi when he did this, right? So immediately, and it was very powerful because he was also the first, I don't know whether you know what cancel culture is, but he was the first victim of cancel culture because thereafter his publisher didn't publish him anymore. So his book publisher didn't publish him anymore, and his papers he wrote couldn't be published anymore in Merkur Zeitschrift für Europäisches Denken, which was one of the main big philosophical publications of the time for non-scientific, but papers which were not really scientific, but also not suitable for normal journal, newspaper, but were kind of essays, right? And he couldn't publish his essays anymore there because he was cancelled. And this is very interesting. And so this book is I think the result. He could write this book because of the phenomenological tradition he is from, but also because he had such a clear view of man, or of mankind, right? What it means to be. And so I think this is very interesting. It's sad that it was never translated to English. Maybe it will, because it has now been rediscovered. And it's also because the first two chapters are absolutely absurd. So the first two chapters deal with Greek philosophy in the 3rd century at a super detailed level, because he says after Athens was defeated by Sparta, they developed a loser moral, he said, an ethics of the loser. And he then describes in very detail that basically Epicurean philosophy is ethics of the loser, right? and then when you get defeated to that extreme point, then you cannot do good philosophy anymore. and these two first chapters are full of Greek quotations that are not translated, because of course the reader has to know classical Greek. He can easily read this. I mean, fortunately I really could, so I could read it, but it puts a big obstacle against reading the entire book. And then in chapter 3 he says that now Germany has been defeated by the Americans, which he doesn't criticize, but now we also have ethics of the loser. And then in a way, the hypermorality is for him the ethics of the loser. So it's a tough book, right? And it offended, of course, the Western Marxist culture that was after 1968 dominating Germany, and that's why Habermas attacked him so viciously. But I think a lot is very good about this book. So, but nowadays you could get the PDF and put it into ChatGPT, and you would certainly get a good basic idea. You can ignore the first 2 chapters, it's fascinating, because you know what he did, Barry? He basically went deeply into this whole, classical philology it's a very special branch of classical philology that deals with the 3rd century, because it's Hellenism. Hellenism is regarded as the bronze phase of the classical stuff. You want to read Aristotle and Plato, know this Hellenism, but he actually totally deals with it, and it's kind of, I think he must have spent a couple of months to write these chapters just to think himself into this loser ethic, as he called it.
So, and we have the picture on the screen. I think it comes from Charles Dickens, and I'm not sure whether he cites Charles Dickens, but Charles Dickens describes this woman, I've forgotten her name, who devotes her life to helping some poor village in Africa and lets her children starve, basically, her own children.
Yeah, that's why you use it, okay.
Yeah.
But it looks very Victorian, this picture. And,
oh, of course, yeah.
Okay, so this is just to add to what Barry said about guilt. So I think while morality and hypermorality is certainly very interesting to understand what's going on today, the more philosophically fundamental book is Man, and I recommend it to read it. It's fascinating because it's also the first philosophical book that uses heavily science, biology, to create a philosophical work. And that was our template also for the AI book, because in the AI book we also use a lot of scientific facts and knowledge of science to argue philosophically. So and not many philosophers have done this